So firstly, hi and welcome to the first of our Harsh Light webinar series. My name's Dave. I'm the director of Bloc Projects. My preferred pronouns are he and him. And I just wanted to start by saying I'm a white man who's wearing a black t-shirt, black glasses and short blonde hair. And also just to introduce the format of the webinar today. So ideally, we'd like people to remain muted if possible, and also to keep their cameras off so that on the screen you will just see the speakers and our wonderful BSL interpreters, Vicky and Karen. If you select in the top corner gallery view, then you should only have the people who are currently speaking and the BSL interpreters, the only people who have their cameras on. And we're going to be using the chat function to be able to ask questions and to be able to contribute to the conversation as attendees as the webinar moves on. So shortly, I'm going to pass you over to my colleague Sunshine, who's going to introduce the themes of the webinar and introduce the speakers today. So just to introduce how the running order is going to be. So after Sunshine speaks, she'll be passing over to the speakers. At about 7:40, we're going to have a short 10-minute break for everyone to just have a refreshment break and just get away from the screens for a little bit before coming back for the final half. And then we're going to pass back over to the speakers. And then finally, we're going to have about 10 or 15 minutes for Q&As that Sunshine's and myself are going to be picking out some questions and some contributions from the chat to pose back to the speakers. So just a final few things. If anybody feels more comfortable asking a question or contributing through the through video, then just let us know in the chat function, and we'll make sure that we can enable your video so you can either sign a question or ask a question in that way if it feels more comfortable. Finally, the webinar has been recorded to be put on the website afterwards. So if anybody has any issues, feel free just to get in touch with us. We'll be able to circulate all of our contact information for Bloc afterwards. And without further ado, I will pass you over to Sunshine. Thanks.
Can you hear me now? Great. So thank you everyone for coming to Harsh Light tonight. My name is Sunshine and I am the public program coordinator at Bloc Projects. My preferred pronouns are she and her. And yeah, to follow what Dave was doing, I can describe a little bit about where I am and what I look like. I'm at home and it is late evening. I'm Chinese and I have black hair tied into a ponytail, a fringe that kind of needs cutting, some glasses, and yeah, this is quite an interesting exercise in kind of situating the hosts a little bit, and it feels quite disarming, which I think is a good thing for this conversation. It feels like what we're trying to do here is to invite something a bit more open, gentle, and honest to talk about topics that are quite complicated and difficult. So, so yeah, I think what I'll be doing is to give a little context about Harsh Light to start with, and then introduce Jade and Um's practices. And then after that, I was hoping to do a short kind of breathing and centering exercise, which the idea for that is to kind of put aside everything that we've been dealing with in the day and to settle the mood for something that's a little bit more open and generous. Of course, if you're not comfortable doing that, you don't have to do this. And it'll just be 2 to 3 minutes, so you can either step away or just tune out for that time. So yeah, Harsh Light. It's a webinar series that this is the first of the series, and Dave and I have been thinking about this, working on this for the last few months, basically since COVID started. when this whole thing happened, we were quite unsure of how we were going to proceed as an organization, what kind of programming we were going to do. And a lot of questions we had in the beginning were just more basic survival questions of how this whole year was going to pan out. And we applied for funding, didn't get funding. And so, yeah, programming wasn't really in the forefront of our minds. But as the months went on, it felt like these questions of survival were really kind of circulating, not just between ourselves, but between friends and peers. And it felt like that we wanted to have a bit more of a public platform to discuss some of these questions, some concerns. And yeah, that's how Harshlight came about. And we wanted this to be a place where we could talk about working in the arts right now, all the structures that we have to navigate, and how we're currently bending our lives to fit around them. And we wanted to invite speakers like Jade and tonight to help us differently process and reflect on what it means to survive and flourish in the arts now. So tonight's session, we have Jade and they are both part of the recently formed Black Curators Collective, BCC, which Jade co-initiated. And BCC is a collective of Black women and non-binary curators in the UK. It acts as a network for cross-regional support and for the instigating of collaborative projects. They have members from across England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, including staff from institutions like CCA, Eastside Projects, National Museum Wales, New Art Exchange, Somerset House, and Tate. Jade is the assistant curator at Primary and the creative program coordinator at New Art Exchange in Nottingham. They are the recipient of this year's Curating Borders residency with Performing Borders Live 20 and Never Done. And Umulkhayr, or is a Welsh Somali artist, writer, and curator who is currently an Amgueddfa Cymru producer at National Museum Wales. She is also the curation lead of Late's Pitch Black, a collaboration between National Museum Cardiff and Artus Mundi that will be a multi-art form celebration of Blackness. Also consults on a strategic level regarding widening engagement, including with Arts Council Wales and the BFI. So now we're going to get to the breathing and centering exercise. If you're taking part in this, I invite you to stand up. You can turn away from the computer. I myself will keep facing so you can see what I'm doing. So I'm going to take my headphones off for a moment. It's basically a breathing exercise. So if you can, just stand up and have your arms relaxed to your sides. And we will breathe through our nose in and out 3 times, filling up our chest, trying to create space around our heart. So in and out 3 times through the nose. In and out. In and out. In and out. If your eyes are closed, you can open them and just soften your gaze at whatever you're looking. There's no need to judge whatever you're looking at. Feel the feet, your feet, planting on the ground, the balls and the heels of your feet steady on the ground. And the top of your head just growing taller, like it's being pulled on a string. Giving some space in your back. Just between each cup of your spine, imagine that there's just a little air pocket every time you kind of push yourself up from the ground with your feet and grow taller with your head. We're going to do just 2 more deep breaths before we come back to sit in front of our computer and devices. So again, we're trying to create space and openness around our chest area. So try and breathe and concentrate getting that air into your lungs and your chest. So breathing in, breathing out. In and out. Thanks for doing that with us. So yeah, hopefully that helps to settle whatever it is in the day a little bit and to refocus their energies and to this conversation tonight. So yeah, thank you, thank you, Jade, for joining us tonight, giving us your time, your energy. So the first part of the conversation, there have been some questions that they've pre-prepared, and so these 2 questions are kind of interrelated, and you'll be talking through these for the first part. So I'll just read out the questions. What are your thoughts on how both Arts Council England and Arts Council Wales have functioned both before and after Black Lives Matter when it comes to your interactions with their respective inclusion and diversity efforts? And how has your experiences of Arts Council England and Arts Council Wales informed how you think strategically about decentering and challenging old hierarchies? So yeah, I'll hand it over to you now, Jade and
Sunshine. Vicky, do you want to squat? Just changing interpreters, sorry.
Firstly, I just want to make sure I've got some noise in the background. I just want to also describe myself. So I'm Jade. I go by they, them pronouns. I am a Black person with short hair that is tapered on the sides. I'm wearing a kind of teal blue jumper with a zipper, and I'm currently in a studio space which is primary. So apologies for the noise if you can hear a little bit in the background. It's quite an old building. It used to be an old primary school, so the insulation's not so great, but yeah.
And I'm my pronouns are she, her. And to describe myself a bit, I'm a Black woman who's currently wearing a black headscarf, some hoop earrings, and a cream t-shirt. And I'm at home.
So I just want to begin to potentially kind of firstly say that Black Curators Collective was an initiative that partially came out of the Black Lives Matter protests globally, but it was also something I really wanted to kind of set up because since I've been in the industry, there's been a lack of networks, ability to come together and share practices, but also share concerns. I think that forums and spaces for Black curators and practitioners are rare in a long-term capacity, and I felt the necessity and urgency to really reach out to people and engage them within this collective. And it also came out of researching and wanting to know what Black curators are currently practicing in the UK, where are they based, what are they doing, how can I collaborate with them actively, how can I build relationships that will help us to survive the art world. And I say surviving because it does sometimes feel like from the beginning, when you're a junior level staff member in a cultural organization or an arts organization, like you're always in resistance to these systems that kind of are oppressive or are very difficult to navigate. And so I think that this collective, for me, I can speak for me, has been a lifeline to just meet like-minded people, to be really open and honest as well about our experiences, to not filter our experiences, for it not to be used as a kind of, and weaponized in a way by other people, but it's about us kind of being in a closed door environment, able to be open, transparent with each other, able to speak freely. And I think those spaces are rare. We're always, you know, the time, if we're speaking about these subjects, it's in a public facing capacity. And I think that is, yes, partially it's important to open that conversation up publicly, but it's also important for us to kind of strategize and self-actualize and self-determine what we need for ourselves, what we need for growth, etc. So I guess also I can talk a bit about Arts Council England, both pre and post Black Lives Matter. So Arts Council England has a, I would say, a kind of strategy that was around the creative case for diversity. And this strategy underpinned the way Arts Council England navigated inclusion and diversity in England. And this was the framework that was in place pre-COVID. And I kind of digged into their diversity report in 2018, 2019. And even themselves say within this report, I'm going to quote the report. So they say, whilst we cannot make direct comparisons between the last report and this year's, this report has confirmed that Arts Council and the organisations we invest in are still not representative of this country as a whole. The long-standing issue of underrepresentation in both the portfolio and the Arts Council itself has to be recognised and addressed. So themselves have already stipulated in that report in 2018, 2019 that these issues of underrepresentation need to be addressed. And they also, within this report, report on data to do with diversity, and they break it down within this report. So I'm just going to also quote the percentages of MPO, which means National Portfolio Organisation. So these are organisations that are regularly funded by Arts Council England, and these organisations get a period of 4 years of funding, which they have to reapply for. So that's how it works in terms of getting regular investment and funding from Arts Council. So these aren't usually project grants. These are long-term investment in an organisation's programming or an investment in their development. So they reported in this report the total percentage of the national portfolio organisations workforce with a Black and minority ethnic background is 11%. Black minority ethnic board representation across the national portfolio organisations is slightly higher at 15%. The percentage of Black minority ethnic chief executives is 10%. Chairs and artistic directors are both at 11%. So for me, it's really clear that it's disproportionate to, in terms of leadership, in terms of our curators, practitioners, cultural workers at a strategy level, at a leadership level. It's very clear to me that this is completely underrepresented within England generally. And I mean, if it's possible, if I can share my screen, but I started to do some research on Black curators who are at board level, at artistic director level. I just want to share my screen to just show, this is not completed research, but just to show a bit of research I've been doing on this specifically. So hold on. Oh, it's disabled. Possible to share my screen? If not, it's okay.
I think it should be possible now.
Okay, great. So, can people see the screen?
Mm-hmm.
Great. So this spreadsheet, I don't want to go into detail with it, but I just want everybody to take in the amount of no's, the amount of reds that are on the spreadsheet. And this is not comprehensive completely, but the no's are basically pinpointing, are there any Black curators in these cultural organizations? These are mostly visual art organizations who are from artist-led organizations to medium, large-size cultural institutions. And I just want to also point out that Quad Derby have put in a few of their Black curators. However, these curators are not on their payroll. They are freelance curators. And I just want to also mention that a lot of Black curators are working freelance. They're not on payroll. They're not having kind of frequent permanent employment. They tend to be commissioned for a particular project or commissioned to work on a particular thing. So these these associate curators are working on projects. However, you know, they're permanent staff. So their senior curator, Peter Bonnell, the artistic director, and their assistant curator are all white. And those are people who are determining the programming, determining who to engage. They're the ones with decision-making abilities to determine what Black curators are engaged in their programming, their festivals, their projects. So even though, you know, organizations may have Black curators or Black cultural practitioners, they're usually kind of underpaid, undervalued. They're usually a project by project, called in project by project. And I think that is quite gross in terms of like the disparity between junior level staff, freelancers, and also senior staff. I think that also Black curators tend to be the least paid within the cultural organization, and they tend to be within junior positions. This is what I found out from reaching out with our collective. Majority of our collective is early career to mid-career curators. However, a lot of the senior level curators are based in London. So that's another point about decentralization and the fact that a lot of curators, Black curators that get to the level of artistic director, tend to be based in London. And this is not echoed nationally, generally throughout the regions as well. I know Shana Jackson, for example, is an artistic director outside of London. However, it's quite rare to see a Black female or Black woman or non-binary curator, especially or artistic director at that level. And then when they get in there, they're met with hostility, they're met with their emotional labor being undervalued, undertreated, and just that, the organization wants them to kind of become a token and to do that structural change for them. And I think that's quite a big issue in terms of Arts Council generally. And I guess I'll stop sharing. I guess also what I would say is that I'm just going to read out some personal things I've heard, lived experiences that I've heard from Black curators and practitioners when they arrive into these cultural organisations. So
we'll just change interpreter while you do that. Lovely, thank you.
One of them is being told on your first day of work that you think you are better than you are. So you were labelled as arrogant, you were labelled as confrontational, you were labelled as a problem, basically, interpreted as an issue, as something that's going to cause an issue to the institution. Like you don't already have to work 2 or 3 times harder than your white colleagues to earn the same level of respect or promotion. Being told that you can come across as overconfident or rude in formal and informal meetings by white colleagues. Being seated by a manager and being put into a hierarchy and told where you sit within this on your first few days of work. And yes, you are told you're at the bottom. Being continually misgendered or continually kind of racially profiled within these jobs, within these roles. Employing you as a freelancer because they didn't offer you an employed job in the organization. So that's the kind of, if you don't get the job, then they'll take you in as a freelancer, but again, that's precarious work. They want to support Black and brown people, but then they don't establish any support or necessary infrastructure to help you do the work that you need to do. So you inevitably struggle. When you ask to be a part of a project or aspect of a project which can support your professional development and learning, you are turned down or shut out of the process because your white colleagues think it's easier to do it themselves. All of these microaggressions means that your mental health deteriorates and your confidence, which you worked so hard to build, starts to go away. And I just wanted to say that because I feel that kind of echoes a lot of the experiences that both myself and my colleagues have experienced within these cultural institutions. So it's not just about getting into these positions, it's not just about diversifying, but it's about creating the environment for Black curators and underrepresented practitioners to thrive. And that's the issue. It's not just thinking about filling these spaces, but it's about creating the environment to allow them to be able to stay, for them to feel safe, for them to feel that they can do their best work, that they're supported in that work. And I guess I can take it to to kind of talk about Arts Council Wales.
Thank you, Jade. So in terms of my experience with Arts Council Wales, there are some similarities with Arts Council England. For example, they had strategies pre-Black Lives Matter, that looked at diversity and inclusion. In our case, that was the for the benefit of all strategy. But what we did differently in Wales is the Arts Council kind of married that with setting up of a role called the Arts Associates, which I am one of. And this role was kind of developed with that diversity and inclusion strategy in mind. And it was inviting people who work within the arts in Wales in whatever capacity, in various capacities, that's artists and art workers, to help inform the Arts Council's thinking around diversity and inclusion by inviting them in to see their internal processes, take part in them in certain instances. So to give an example of that, as a part of my role as an arts associate, I have sat in on grant assessment meetings and taken part in them. both for portfolio organizations and also projects, project funding. So I have seen, I guess, essentially the behind the scenes of how the Arts Council make the decisions of who is funded and who isn't. And they kind of have set up this structure so that you are able to see these things, which is a very rare thing to do if you're not an employee of the Arts Council, as a way to invite critical thinking around that and to invite an outsider's perspective in terms of how we see those processes working. And just to also clarify, that is a paid role. And for me, what kind of drew me to that was they were quite explicit in their call out for arts associates, that they were looking for a diverse and activist outlook. I think the language is really important because it acknowledges the arts associates as a role that can be used in pushing forward meaningful change, which is what I wanted to see happen in Wales. In terms of how that feeds into where we find ourselves now in a world that is post Black Lives Matter movement, but it's still being pushed forward by this movement. I, as an arts associate, was really well positioned when everything happened to meet with both the trustees of the Arts Council and senior staff members to share my kind of views on what I felt like they needed to do, what I felt like they needed to address, as they acknowledged that Black Lives Matter had brought forward a shift in how diversity and inclusion is perceived. And for the first time, I think people were talking about structural inequalities, or I should say institutions were talking about structural inequalities. People were obviously talking about that beforehand, especially people who are impacted by those inequalities. And that really kind of informed the Arts Council of Wales's Black Lives Matter statement, which is a statement with a 10-point action plan to address these inequalities. And as a part of my arts associate role, I'm currently helping them kind of complete the first step, which is, let me just pull it up so I can get the wording right. To establish within a matter of weeks a series of conversations between council and artists from Black and other minority ethnic backgrounds, as well as our many disadvantaged communities, to share their experiences of living and working in Wales, ensuring that these voices are at the forefront of short-term and long-term actions for change. So I've been kind of chairing and holding space for those conversations. The first one happened a couple of months ago now, and was exclusively Black artists and art workers, because as arts associates, we fed in and said that we also need to acknowledge the power dynamics between Black people and non-Black people of colour in these conversations, and how Black people are often an afterthought, even though we're most impacted by structural racism. So that's some of the work that we've been kind of doing in Wales. And in terms of my relationship, my connection with the Black Curators Collective, I think me kind of sharing my experiences with Black curators who are based in England and Scotland has been really insightful in understanding what Wales is doing differently, and also what, both in the good and the bad, and also just to kind of, I guess, feed each other in understanding what is possible in doing this work, and how we can learn from each other, which I think is really vital. There are less people of colour in Wales and in Wales's art sector, but it's still disproportionate in terms of the Black people of colour, working within the arts and working within the arts in positions of influence and power. I mean, a lot of the people of colour that I know who work in the sector in Wales are also freelancers, so we have similar kind of issues in the precarity of the positions of people of colour in the sector. But yeah, just being in conversation and holding space for each other with Black Curators Collective has been really kind of vital in this time, and in understanding what I need to be doing in Wales and how I can help colleagues across the UK.
I'd also like to just kind of add to that and say that has been really integral in how we've approached potential consultancy with Arts Council England. So I had a meeting with Abid Hussain, who's a Director of Diversity for Arts Council England, to propose, I think we can kind of develop that, as the conversation goes further, but to propose what should we be doing now in terms of strategy. Mm-hmm. I really wanted to kind of talk about those experiences because actually they are structural issues, they're structural inequalities, because it's not on an individual mm-hmm. basis that these incidents happen. This mm-hmm. is a widespread, a lot of the things I was talking about is widespread. And that's when it becomes structural, that's when it becomes embedded, when those experiences are then, reinforced and kind of mm-hmm. really embedded in every aspect of the way an organisation works. Mm-hmm. And this is also embedded in Arts Council England itself. Mm-hmm. And they've obviously acknowledged that. So from this kind of conversation with Abid Hussain, he was saying that a lot of Black and Brown colleagues in Arts Council England have stepped up to create this BLM statement. However, I would pose the question, who is being consulted on that beyond Arts Council England within their internal staff team? Who is being consulted on that? And how transparent is that process? And I think that I just want to connect that back to Arts Council Wales, because they've been very transparent in saying and pinpointing and publishing who is exactly these art associates, who are exactly consulting in this process, how it's being done, and also the code of conduct in the way that how people are engaged, are they being paid, what are they being paid, you know what I mean? So it's important for Arts Council England, I think, what they haven't been doing pre and post-COVID is being transparent between who is consulting on their policies, both regionally and nationally, who are the organisations, the individuals, the artistic directors, etc., the freelancers, etc., who have been through, talking with them through this process. And, when I did kind of suggest that Black Curators Collective could consult with Arts Council nationally, the way that Arts Council England works is that they work through mostly regional bodies, and instead of a national body. I think that Arts Council Wales is smaller, so they can, they don't really work from regions. And so one of the suggestions that Abid said that I should do is apply for a project grant to do this consultancy work. And they said that that would be easier than me getting £50 from Arts Council to inform their policies. So I just find it quite interesting that when I did ask him what can he, who has he been consulting with to write the BLM statement and to write their policies, their new kind of 10-year strategy for change, etc. I think there is a lack of transparency there. So I would really love to see and work with Arts Council England very much so to see if we can create that information to become more transparent, and for Arts Council England to become more accountable, I would say, to the statements they write, who is writing that, what staff members are writing that, is it white colleagues? All of the board in Arts Council England is white, for example. So if that's getting checked and balanced through the board, who is who is actually contributing to that effort. So that's what I would like to also say.
Thank you so much, Jade and I'm just aware of time, only because I want to make sure that our interpreters have a little bit of a break before we continue in the second part of the discussion. But yeah, there's already so much that we can be talking about, and so many questions that I'd like to ask as well, especially this whole thing about transparency and how the officer that you had spoken to, sorry, I've forgotten the name, actually said back to you, oh, why don't you apply for a project grant in order to gain access to consulting the Arts Council, which seems quite strange of an advice. But yeah, I would love to continue this conversation a bit further after we've had a break. So it is now almost 7:45. Let's say we come back. I want to be quite precise with the 10 minutes. So it's on my clock, it's 7:43. So 7:53, if we can come back, then we can continue the second part. So thank you. Hi, right on the dot, 7:53. So here we are in the second part of our conversation with Jade and and just having read what you posted in the chat, I think it's the statement put out by Arts Council Wales. It's very, it feels very thorough, really, really thoughtful. It feels like there's a lot of accountability there. And it feels like this is also a good place to lead into the second question, or the second part of the conversation rather, which is, how do you as Black curators think these funding bodies should be moving towards strategic structural change that addresses structural inequality? So yeah, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, no, it definitely is really thorough, and like I said, that came out of a conversation with a few arts associates of colour. So that, I think that is an example of how having these kind of ways of working in places kind of really shine in these moments, where they already knew who to reach out to begin those conversations. And it's also actually reflective of having people at trustee level who were really supportive in pushing this change forward. We have a predominantly white board of trustees for Arts Council Wales, but we do have 2 people of colour, and they've been really instrumental during this time in terms of pushing change forward and holding Arts Council Wales to account. So in terms of being a Black curator and how that's informing how I see these funding, how I see what the task of these funding bodies are during this time, I would say it's a slightly different position to being an artist, although I'm that as well, in that I'm able to, I work within organizations, or I work closely with organizations, and that I think is at the level where the structural inequalities exist. So because of our position as Black curators, I'm closer to those structures, those processes, those ways of working, and I experience them as a staff member. So I feel like I'm able to see why that is so important to focus on. In terms of conversations that I've had with Arts Council Wales since Black Lives Matter, I think I've been really stressing this thing of holding organisations that they fund to account, because one thing that I've seen kind of time and time again over the past years, but have really reflected on deeply since Black Lives Matter happened, is just how much these organisations have understood previous inclusion and diversity strategies and priorities, and interpreted them in ways that continue to harm people of colour quite actively. And this comes in the form of tokenization, in the form of like how outreach a lot of the time is structured in a way that maintains power dynamics between organizations and communities of colour, as if the organizations are the holders of culture and their outreach work is to essentially culture the uncultured people of colour. I've seen that really explicitly. So I understand that it's inclusion and diversity isn't enough, and we need to look at structural inequalities. We need to look at structural and institutional racism and how that shows up, and develop systems that don't let these inequalities and this form of racism exist, especially within publicly funded organizations. Yeah, those are the kind of things that I've been thinking about and communicating to Arts Council Wales. Jade, do you want to jump in at this point?
Yeah, I would echo that with my meeting with Arts Council England's Director of Diversity. I've also spoke a lot about structural inequality, change in terms of policy. So I could share this policies ideas with you guys, but these policy ideas came out of meetings with the Black Curators Collective, out of conversation with Shauna Jackson, who's an advisor for Black Curators Collective, out of conversations that I've been in with my colleagues at cultural institutions that are publicly funded by Arts Council England. So let me just get this up. So one of these policies, or strategies to really think about Black curators' position within cultural organisations and what kind of positions they take would be to create a max term for directors of national portfolio organisations. So this max term would create limitations of power, so that art directors, board of trustees, senior management aren't in positions of power and becoming gatekeepers for other Black curators and practitioners to progress within those organizations, and to with that progression to actually create a sense of innovation, because at Arts Council England, within a lot of their strategies, mention the word innovation a lot. And I think that actually this policy will improve mobility across the sector generally, allowing for career progression, allowing for new strategical development, allowing for changes of vision and ending gatekeeping. There are some directors that have been in their positions for 20 years. And also within that, they lose passion, they lose drive, they lose a sense of innovation, a sense of development, because they're kind of controlling the creative direction of that organization. And I think that having a max term of, say, 8 years will create more of a generous sector, and it will make it easier for underrepresented and young cultural workers like myself, like a lot of us in the Black Curators Collective, to become future leaders and decision makers. Like I was saying before, there are literally a handful of artistic directors who are Black in the UK, who are funded by Arts Council England. And I think that also another thing that came out of that is employees should review directors after 4 years, determining whether they can continue. So actually the accountability shouldn't just be on Arts Council having this accountability in terms of themselves, but also cultural organisations that they fund, but also employees having a sense of determining a sense of who should stay, and actually how that director is supporting their professional growth, their professional development, but also the organisation. And I think that artistic directors, board of trustees should be more accountable to their stakeholders. And I say stakeholders as a way of saying about the audiences, the freelance practitioners, the employees, the people who are working in those spaces. I would also say that another policy would be better wages for junior staff. I'm currently getting paid, I would say, under what people should be paid in my level of job. And I think this is generally a problem across the arts. And I think that needs to be addressed because that disproportionately affects Black curators and Black cultural workers. And I think that pay should increase every year, minimally, in a certain incrementally every year, so that actually the wages are growing and they're all kind of in line with actually what labor, both emotional labor, both intellectual labor, both practical labor is being actually incorporated. Because a lot of these ideas of change comes from junior staff, Black practitioners in those roles, and they're feeding these ideas to senior members within the organization, but then their role never really reflects actually what they're contributing in these organizations. A lot of people get tired of being valued in the way that they're actually contributing to the way the organization is working. I would also say closing the pay gap as well, so that the disparity in pay scales, and this a lot has happened currently in the UK around Tate, around South Bank, etc., around pay scales. Some of the senior directors of cultural organizations are getting paid six figures, right? And you have some of the lowest paid workers getting paid £17,000 a year, usually part-time work as well. And the disparity between those workers and then the directors is humongous. It's incredible. It's absurd. And I just think that also needs to be addressed. I would also say that should also be applied to the board, applied to board of trustees as well. And looking at how we maybe potentially introduce a pay cap for NPO and National Portfolio Organisation directors, so that they can't earn ridiculous amounts of money, disparately, and that their pay is capped to a certain limit, potentially. So I think there's a few things we've been talking about in the collective that I would really want to introduce that we think would transform the way that Arts Council England kind of fund, but also it would put pressure on those organisations to really keep it moving, keep the flow of people, and also the flow of kind of progression and transformation, keep that going, because the creative industries is stagnant right now. There's hardly any growth. There's hardly any, paid opportunities, jobs. A lot of the jobs are either pro rata, part-time, low paid. Artists aren't paid well. Like, this is a widespread issue in the arts, and I think this really does disproportionately affect Black curators to the point where we're trying to get our professional development elsewhere, hence setting up Black Curators Collective, because that's not on offer for me in my current roles. And so we seek it elsewhere. We seek these networks outside of the institutions we work for. We seek support and we do projects outside of our working hours. But that means that we're also doing our job, but then more, that will actually then benefit the institutions we're associated with. So that's also a thing of acknowledging that your work outside of, if you are employed by a cultural institution, your work outside of that is going to benefit the institutions you work for in some way, shape or form. And that needs to be really acknowledged. And so I think that, Black Curators Collective would love to consult with Arts Council England. And yeah, I've been reading the comments, and it is absurd that, you know, going into this meeting, I think that a lot of the things he was saying was all valid. He was telling me that some of the kind of suggestions that I was making is things that he's also thinking about. But I think that, you know, collectives like mine and our collective and other practitioners should be consulted in these processes. So I would love to see the data, so the data that I was reading out earlier, being actually connected to lived experiences, because all we're seeing is numbers, and people are beyond data. It's more nuanced. The structural inequality is complicated, it is embedded, it is insidious. It flows through every single avenue of a cultural organization, from, you know, from board level to junior staff, you know. So I think that the way that Arts Council England reports needs to be more comprehensive, it needs to be more transparent, it needs to be more accountable, but also it needs to be beyond data. And I know that Arts Council England introduced a metric system that was kind of met strong, outstanding, to grade cultural organizations on their creative case for diversity. And this metric system organizations that were unmet in terms of the way that they tackled diversity or approached diversity within their organizations. And I think that that's great, having that metric system, but it's not enough, because actually a lot of these cultural organizations present the best of their work to Arts Council England. So actually Arts Council England aren't really getting a fuller picture about actually how these cultural practitioners are being not supported, shall I say, and how they're being treated within these cultural organizations. And I think that we need to really think about, you know, talking directly to Black and Brown curators about their experiences, and actually that somewhat needs to be fed into the way they report. Because again, like I was saying when I showed the spreadsheet, that you can say you've worked with this person because they've been working on a particular project, but they're not employed on a permanent contract. So there's nuances. They're employed as a freelance. Usually freelance pay is also, it's not really equitable or fair to what you actually are giving them in terms of labor, because they'll use that project as their example of meeting the creative case for diversity, for example. And so, yes, you might have associate curators, yes, you might have, you know, artists or curators in residence, but they're not being employed permanently. You're employing them for a particular project to serve a particular aim of an objective for that organization. And they're not really actually feeding in every element of the organization, not just let me come into this building, let me deliver a program and let me leave, but actually how is that programming being taken forward and really kind of embedded into the way they work on a day-to-day basis. And I think that is the disparity that needs to be addressed personally, and that's what I've experienced through organizations doing projects with Black communities or Black, as was saying, around outreach, how is that approached? And that's what I've kind of experienced in that. Do you want to kind of say more about that, or?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I just wanted to pick up on one point that you made a bit earlier, which was around how lived experience feeds into this. And it shouldn't just be data we are looking at when we are trying to figure out a way forward, or these funding bodies are trying to figure out a way forward that is more equitable. And just to share a bit more about the conversations that I've been helping facilitate. I mean, first of all, the fact that they are happening, and to share a bit more about this structure, they are conversations where we by we I mean Arts Council Wales, invite artists and art workers of colour to attend and it is also attended by the CEO of Arts Council Wales, the chair of the Board of Trustees of Arts Council Wales, a few other senior members of staff. So it's a direct conversation between the people who have the positions and power and influence to make changes, and these artists and art workers of colour who are sharing their lived experience of both Arts Council Wales funding and how their experiences with that, but also with the sector at large and mainly white staffed organisations. So for example, Arts Council Wales's national portfolio of organisations, I think there's around 60 portfolio organisations in Wales, and only one is a Black-led organisation. So the majority of organisations in Wales that have sustained funding and therefore the paid opportunities in the sector are white-led, white-staffed organisations. The resources that they get are from Arts Council Wales. So it's really important that Arts Council Wales hear what the experiences of artists and art workers of colour who've either worked for these organisations or have been commissioned by them, have what those experiences have been like, and those experiences are validated. I think that's really vital, and to share more, because I think it's really important to focus on care and how these conversations are held. Us as arts associates have kind of set fees, a day rate and a half day rate. And in setting up these conversations, we as arts associates were quite explicit that these people of colour need to be paid because it's a lot of emotional labour, and during a time where trauma is kind of heightened. So anybody who is attending these conversations are also getting paid the same amount that arts associates are getting paid. So we've set a precedent with that. We basically used the Arts Council's own precedent to lobby for other people of colour to be paid for this labour as well, which is really important to kind of stress in the way that we are doing this work. It's very easy when you are pushing forward for this kind of change and you care a lot about it and you are personally impacted by it. You kind of undervalue yourself in the process. And I've been really conscious during this time in particular to not do that for myself, but also make sure that other people of colour are not taken advantage of in that way either. So yeah, it's not only about how these funding bodies kind of move forward, but in that journey, every step of the way, it has to be equitable. It has to be in the way that they conduct this work, in the way that they're learning to be better. They have to be held to account.
And I would also go and say that what I found is that these people, these Arts Council officials in England aren't visible. So we don't know who these officials are. We don't know how they're working, who they've consulted with, who they've held meetings with. It's not visible. So what I would say is it's actually really, really important, both regionally and nationally, that the directors of these various different departments, be that visual arts and museums, be that dance, be that theatre, be that on diversity, be that chairs, regional chairs, be that people who are part of the committees that are dealing with on a regional level, including Sheffield, North of England, that they make themselves visible to people, so that if there are people like, for example, myself and curators in Black Curators Collective, that they were able to actually have these conversations or approach them. They need to become more approachable, I think, if they really want strategic change to happen, I think it's really important that we actually know, because it's a bureaucracy, these funding bodies are bureaucracies. So you're having to go through one person, which then goes to another person, which goes to another person. But a lot of those times we don't really actually know in detail how Arts Council works unless you're kind of within that or you've had experience with that directly working with them. But I think that for people who do want to say something, who do have good ideas, and that can happen at any level in your career, not just people who've worked 20 years in the industry, but people early career, because actually those people early career, those will be the future leaders, the future artistic directors. So it's important that Arts Council England listens to every single person at every single level, and not just the same kind of people that they're kind of consulting with or talking with. So I think that's really important too.
I just really, what really struck me about what said earlier was this idea that every step of the way, the whole journey has to be equitable. Everybody has to be paid. Everybody's input has to be valued. And it feels like a really obvious thing to say, almost, but it just listening to this whole conversation, what's become really apparent is the complete lack of transparency, how obscure it is, and how difficult it is to even get an opinion across. The idea that you have to write a project grant to help make Arts Council become more, to do its work better, basically. It just seems completely absurd, because that's actually something I'd like to find out. How did that conversation with Abid, sorry, I have to check his name again. Yeah, how did the conversation with Abid actually start? Did you approach him, or how did that conversation start?
So Shana Jackson, who's the advisor for Bloc Projects Collective, put me in touch with the regional director in the north of England, who put me in touch with somebody else. So Shana's contact, then from there, in touch with Abid. From there, a meeting was set, and then it was through Shana's support that we were able to have this conversation with Abid. And I think that during the conversation, his point of view was that the reason we should go for a project grant is because we have more flexibility and freedom to research and use more resource and more money to research and do the work that we need to do, and have more control over that, but the thing is that, I know that 12O Collective, for example, who's another collective who's doing work, a project called Backend, has also applied for project grants to do works on arts-led spaces. But it's kind of like, this work should be paid for by Arts Council. I mean, Arts Council Wales has put forward a significant amount of money to employ arts associates, yet Arts Council England can't really do that. And Abid was saying, that they may give me £50. He kind of was suggesting a number. They may give you £50 to do this work, but actually, if you apply for a project grant, you have more money, more funding, and ability to have control over that. But I don't think it's about necessarily money. It's about having direct relationships with the people who are making decisions. So it's not about us having a lot of money to do this research, even though that would be useful and needed. It's about having that direct link with the people who make decisions regionally and nationally, and to have that input directly, and to understand more transparently what they're actually doing. It's not about us going for a project grant and getting money, but then we would have to still conclude that project and then approach Arts Council with it anyway. So it doesn't make sense, and I understand his reasoning for suggesting that. And he kind of said that he'd put me in touch with two other officials, the Director of Visual Arts and Director of Museums in Arts Council England. So those are the conversations I will end up having again with them. And then we'll see also regionally as well, because of the way that Arts Council is set, you kind of go through regional first before you kind of influence national. I'm not sure, but it's quite bureaucratic in terms of how it's kind of set and who supports who. You have these relationship managers, etc., that deal with various organizations. It's very, but these individuals, are they also having input in these policies? Like, I'm not sure. So actually, who are the people we need to talk to really instigate some change? Because this is, the Black Arts Movement, I just want to say, the Black Arts Movement in the 80s, we're talking 40 years ago at least. And then Abid was talking before that, 50s, 60s, that Black curators, practitioners have been calling for change, but it's repetitive. Speaking to a lot of colleagues senior to me, who've been working since the 90s or the 80s, who have also expressed the same issues that they face when approaching Arts Council. So there's something fundamentally wrong with the way they're working. That means that they're completely failing Black curators generation after generation after generation, and they keep on reinventing their strategy, changing their language, but actually it's not rooted in anything really, apart from data and apart from surveys and questionnaires, etc., that Arts Council gets their MPOs to fill out for them, or the data that you report on your equality and diversity data monitoring forms. But that's as far as it goes, potentially that, certain regional directors or regional chairs, etc., might have more relationships with regional organizations, for example, the Midlands or the North of England. But then how is that is doing things differently? Where is the kind of minimum across the board? What is the standard then across the board for everybody to be accountable to? It's also thinking about that. Some regions are more developed than others in addressing this, in thinking about anti-racist strategies, anti-racist policies. Certain regions are very underdeveloped in that area. So there's a disparity between regions as well. The Midlands tend to be stronger at that, maybe than the North of England, in my kind of observation. London's quite strong at that, but again, these are very concentrated naturally due to there being a lot of Black and brown communities in those cities or regions. But there are still Black curators and practitioners that need support in the North of England, that need support in South East England, that need support in all these regions. So we still need to make sure that they're getting equally as much support as we're getting in the Midlands or London, for example.
Yeah, feels like there is a fundamental issue of kind of trying to redistribute so many different things: resources, care, access to the right people, and but at the same time, in your account, and also less so, but definitely in your account, the frustration of having entered and having had some what feels like good conversations to begin with, then being asked to come back out again and stand in the back of the queue and to re-enter it through a project grant. Not like this conversation didn't actually catalyze the anything, or am I being somewhat
It catalyzed enthusiasm for the fact that he was tying the policies that were coming up with things that he's also thinking about. He said, I did my research. He said I was well articulated. A lot of compliments there about my mannerisms, the way I approached it, that I asked very critical questions about who's consulting with who, the accountability, etc. He was the one who raised, and also other colleagues raised, issues around BLM, etc. So, I think it was it was a good conversation, but I felt like he's kind of passed me on, handed me over, or wants to hand me over to other colleagues to then have further conversations. But there's no real commitment to kind of thinking, he's open to having the further conversation, but it doesn't feel like it may kind of end up in anything tangible. But I'm keen to still work with Arts Council England. We're keen to still work with them. We want to redistribute that money into, one thing we're big on in the collective is that people who are full-time, we're thinking about how money is distributed, what opportunities we're giving to freelancers within the group, thinking about also the power relations within our own group. And we'd love to take that money back in to then even pay the freelancers within our collective, or to put that back into activity that we know we need to do to become a more tighter collective. So it's not going to anybody's personal pocket, that consultancy money that we're potentially asking for. It'd go back into creating activity for the collective, and also supporting freelance practitioners within the collective.
Mm-hmm. I actually want to bring in as well, because you mentioned earlier about these conversations that you'd helped facilitate, and I was just wondering where you found the practitioners from, like what was the process in kind of bringing these groups together?
People's personal contacts, in terms of, I mean, like I said, Wales is quite small, so it's just kind of reaching out to your contacts and then asking them to reach out, and quite quickly we will have covered all of Wales and all of the people of colour working in the arts in Wales. So yeah, practically it's also an easier thing. I appreciate that a lot of the things that we are finding easier in Wales is due to our size, and is due to the fact that we don't have these kind of regional levels when it comes to Arts Council Wales. Like it's more centralised. So we're using that to our benefit in terms of both holding Arts Council of Wales to account, but also reaching out and trying to consult as widely as possible in doing this work.
Sorry, I have to unmute myself. But yeah, thank you so much. I'm very wary of the time that we're coming to the end of the webinar, and I want to make sure that we all have the rest of the evening to ourselves. So really at this point, I'd like to say thank you to everyone, to our two interpreters, Vicky and Karen, to Jade and and of course to Dave as well, my colleague, who has been working the admin in the background. So yeah, if there's any comments or anything that people would like to give us any afterthoughts, please do email us and let us know. That would be great. So yeah, thank you, and I hope everybody has a good night.